Hi everyone, so as the title of the video suggests, I just want to clarify, today we're going to be comparing boss health and damage before and after the final shape. So as you guys probably saw in my most recent video, obviously we're minus 5 power now, and every single raid and dungeon, the RPLs have all changed to be 1950, locked at minus 5, 1945, like we talked about. So I wanted to talk about, how does that actually change how much ammo you need to kill every single boss? Did Bungie actually tweak health values outside of that behind the scenes? We're going to take a look at that. I'm very fortunate enough to have tested every single raid and dungeon's boss health from before this season, and I'm going to compare it to values that I got over the past week this season. So I'll give you an insider look at all of that data. As usual, if you want to see any of this data for yourself, you can go ahead and look at the link in the description. There are spreadsheets there, the boss health spreadsheet, the boss damage spreadsheet. You can check out both of them on your own time. So first, a lot of you have been asking me questions, asking me to make videos, updating the tier list spreadsheet and all that stuff. So I just wanted to update you guys on where things are in terms of progress. I should be able to produce some videos relatively soon. I've been doing a lot of testing recently. So if you guys have been paying attention to the spreadsheet, the weapons tab has been completely updated. Every single value is now here. So I'm going to be plugging those into rotations, plugging them into the sustained and swap tab, which will be completed in the near future as well. So some interesting stuff here. You can compare it to old values if you have another copy of the spreadsheet, if you are interested. I have also completed the equipment tab. You'll notice stuff like, solipsism, still hunt, all these new items have been added to the spreadsheet, and a lot of stuff like Apex Predator has been moved down. So the equipment tab, for example, that's also been finished up for the most part, unless something new is added. I probably won't touch this in the near future. I've also added something called the reference tab. Now, this is actually a very interesting tab. It's something I've been conceptualizing for a long time, and I had some time recently where I was like, yeah, I think I have enough data in the spreadsheet that I can actually make something like this. So this is really, really interesting. It has a lot of numbers, and I'll explain what all of them mean in a second, because that's going to be part of this video. But just know that that's kind of a tab that you can look at in the future. So that's been added. I've updated all of the boss health values in the bosses tab. So you can see here, for example, Callie used to have, under 10 million. Now she has almost 15. You can see there's a bunch of different health values here that have all been tested using DDT. So all of those have been updated. I'll also clarify some of these numbers here. You'll notice I've also changed my crit value weapon from Sleeper to Queenbreaker. I'll discuss why that was the case as well. Strategies on the right side here. I've kind of emptied this entire area besides some of the kill examples and strats, because those have not really changed that much. Because strategies in terms of killing the actual boss have changed quite a bit. So I will probably update these and make a video on them in the future, so just be aware of that. But for now, they're going to remain empty. I thought it was kind of doing more harm than good by keeping the old strategies there, because they're very outdated. So I decided to empty all of them, and I'll replace them. Currently, a lot of raids are kind of dead speedrunning wise. Not a lot of people are speedrunning them, so a lot of these strategies will probably be stuff that I have to make up on the fly. But for now, I'm going to leave them empty. The abilities and swap tab. Abilities tab, I'm currently working on filling out all these grenades, etc, etc. Once I'm done, this tab will be almost complete. I have a lot of the testing done already, actually. These are the only things that I need to test remaining. And once that's done, I'll fill up all of these cells, and hopefully this tab will be done. The swap tab is also largely abilities, so this tab is kind of empty for the most part as well, besides the weapons. So these will all be filled up as well when the time comes, when I'm done with that testing. And finally, we have rotations. So rotations, the ranking tab, quite different from last season. A lot of new stuff being added, a lot of old stuff being taken out. So once I'm done with the weapons and abilities tabs, and I have some time on my hands, I'll be making some brand new rotations. A lot of you are asking to see how Euphony performs, for example, on Needlestorm Warlock. So a lot of this stuff, it's going to be tested, going to be changed. We'll see how that goes. And that'll be done once the base testing, so weapons and abilities tab, is complete. And finally, I've added this ergo sum tab over here. Some of you pointed out the pronunciation of that word, so I kind of wanted to get it right. But yeah, I've made this new tab here for this wonderful exotic sword. A lot of you guys were like, yo, Aegis, I have this roll, or I've heard, this roll is even better than the perfect 5th caster frame sword, or how's the Vortex, stack up against that? So I decided, this exotic has a crap load of combinations. I want to make sure that I've covered all of my ground when it comes to this sword. So I'll probably make an entire video dedicated to just that sword and the updates on that testing, because this spreadsheet, as you can see, I'll maximize my window here so you can see all of it, is absolutely massive, right? You have base values, you have heavy plus pack hunter, combo plus pack hunter. These two, this one especially in particular, will be tested with 5 people. So we can test it with fireteam scaling for stuff like ignition testing on perfect fifth. So this is going to take a lot of testing, like hundreds and hundreds of tests. But you know, whatever. We'll do it. All right, we'll get it done. But yeah, you won't be hearing from me for a little while for that. I'll probably be done with that maybe, I don't know, wishful thinking like a week or 2 from now, but we'll see. Anyways, that's a really long introduction, but again, kind of needed because I've been working on a lot of stuff in the background in order to kind of muck on through with all this testing that I want to get done. So yeah, now to the topic of this video. I think I've spent like 10 minutes or something just waffling about updates. Let's talk about the reference tab first. So the main questions I want to answer on this in this video are: boss health. Did it change between before final shape and now in terms of effective health? So for example, if you take a weapon that has remained relatively stable between both patches, didn't really receive a major buff or a major, nerf, how many shots will it take to kill a boss before and after the patch? That's number 1. Number 2, right? Can we compare all of these different weapon archetypes against each other in terms of which ones got nerfed more than Bungie said, maybe which ones got buffed more than Bungie said across the patch, right? And number 3, I wanted to clarify some stuff with boss health modifiers and damage strategies when it comes to those modifiers that maybe I didn't clarify as much last season. So first we have this reference tab. I'm going to go ahead and expand my window here so you can see the entire thing. Now, a lot of curiosity has kind of gone into this tab. And so I had this idea a long time ago where, people do damage testing in Destiny, right? A lot of YouTubers, including myself, have done damage testing in Destiny by basically just shooting a specific weapon at a specific boss, and they get a number over maybe a set period of time. If you're lucky, you'll get some testing that's more standardized, more rigorous, right? Some YouTubers have started moving into that direction. But my thought was kind of, can we get the base damage values of every single archetype of weapon in the game, including some exotics, which are obviously not really base damage values, but something like a double fire, special GL, or maybe like an adaptive rocket or an adaptive fusion, right? Let's get the base damage values of all of these and then compare them against each other, ignoring perks, ignoring buffs, ignoring debuffs, ignoring like rain of fire, ignoring like all of these things, right? Can we just get the base damage values of all of them so that we can see how they stack up against each other in the sandbox? And then we can also add on stuff like, Radiant Dance Machines, Restoration Ritual, etc., etc. So that was my idea, right? So basically, let's say you're a Destiny 2 player and you don't want to know how good is Scintillation versus like Apex Predator with Radiant Dance Machines. You want to know how good are linears generally versus adaptive rockets generally. Well, this is what this spreadsheet tab is for, okay? You'll notice in the legendary section, there is no mention of a specific weapon, right? It's just linear adaptive, linear precision, LMG adaptive. And so what this tab aims to do is actually find the base DPS of every single archetype in the game. So you'll notice here there's kind of 3 different modes or 3 different columns that I have for DPS and time to empty. This one is shot to shot. What shot to shot means is if you're shooting this weapon at max fire rate, remember pre-nerf Lunafaction where you were able to shoot Mountaintop without reloading it? You could just hold left click or spam left click and it would go boom, 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 boom over and over at max fire rate. That's what shot to shot DPS is, right? So if you never have to reload a weapon ever, not even using rain of fire, how much DPS would this weapon do? So you'll see, for example, if you see like Mountaintop, micro missile with implosion rounds, that's a massive increase in DPS compared to even if you're just using Rain of Fire or Radiant Dance Machines. That's a massive increase in DPS because being able to shoot a weapon at max fire rate is often, or sometimes, I wouldn't say often, but sometimes just a much, much higher DPS increase than even being able to reload it very quickly. So that's shot to shot DPS, right? Interesting for stuff like Mountaintop, less interesting for stuff like, machine guns, right? Where you're shooting them at max fire rate most of the time anyway. Next, we have optimized DPS. So if you're doing a damage rotation, for example, or if you're using rockets with Radiant Dance Machines or Rain of Fire, right? If you are using this weapon optimally, how much DPS does it do? And then we have regular DPS. Now, a lot of people are asking me, or, saying in my comment section, whatever, they're saying, hey, just, I know, you're making all these crazy damage rotations and, all this stuff and whatever, but what if I just want to use a weapon with the least amount of effort possible, right? Just the least amount of effort. How does, X weapon compare against Y? That's what this regular DPS column is for, right? This DPS column is just using either A, Axiom War Rig, which is super easy to use, right? Or B, Lunafaction Boots with maybe like loader mods. That's it, right? So all of these values, you'll see the regular DPS column has the lowest because it's literally just, if you're shooting this weapon straight and then just manually reloading it fully and then shooting it straight, what's your DPS value, right? So for example, stuff like Acreus, right, which is somewhere over here, Legend of Acreus, that's a huge DPS hit, because I actually just meleeed, shot 3 shots, meleeed 3 shots, and then reloaded 6 shots, right? So lowest effort possible. If you're just using the weapon basically the way it was supposed to be like designed, this is what the regular DPS column is for. So again, you're going to need to make a copy of this spreadsheet to kind of use this the most effectively. Like if you want to sort it from top to bottom, you can't really do that in like the regular copy of the spreadsheet. So feel free to make a copy, play around with these values. You can see what weapons are maybe overrepresented in the meta because they have access to good damage perks, maybe compared to other weapons that maybe don't have such good damage perks. And you'll be able to see the base damage values here, and you can multiply them yourself if you're interested. So yeah, that's a lot of yapping. That's the reference tab. Let's talk about this next section here. Now, this next section was kind of a bonus for me, right? I was kind of excited to try it out. And the whole point of this section on the right side is testing pre-final shape damage versus post-final shape damage. So how did I even calculate this? Well, number one, right? Obviously, I'm testing against Templar, right? You guys know I love Templar. And Templar's boss health actually changed, right? It changed from about 6.3 million to, I believe now it's around like 9.7 million or something like that. So I had to account for that. Obviously, which is why there's an adjusted damage column. I also accounted for the fact that every single weapon in the game that's a legendary lost access to spec mods. So I also accounted for that in my damage calculations, obviously excluding exotics, which you can see here don't have a times 1.07 in their damage calculation. So I said all of that to mean these two columns are the ones that you should be looking at. Okay, so this raw column, what it does is it says between final shape and pre-final shape, so lightfall, how much damage per shot did this weapon lose? This is including surges, by the way, this is including surges. So how much damage per shot did this weapon lose? And you can see across the board, there is a variety of answers. So I think I didn't sort for these, but I'll sort for this because I think it's kind of interesting, right? So let's sort from Z to A. You'll see at the top of the list are swords, right? And this is not really surprising. Swords got a buff because of Pack Hunter, right? Previously, Pack Hunter didn't exist, but I did want to show off, how much swords kind of benefited from getting Pack Hunter. And so instead of the expected, minus 15, minus 20, whatever percentage that you would expect, because of the -5 changes, swords only lost maybe a couple percentage depending on what type of archetype you're talking about. Now, if we move down here, who are the biggest losers? Who are the biggest losers in this patch? You'll see at the bottom, it's stuff like Micro Missile, which is Mountaintop, and you have stuff like Izanagi's Burden. Now, why is that? Obviously, exotic kinetic specials, or just kinetic specials in general, lost a ton of boss damage because of the kinetic damage bonus being removed from the game. So you can stack on an additional 15% to what the base damage value would be for the damage reduction on this. Obviously, coupled with the fact that Izanagi's Burden didn't get the global sniper buff, Mountaintop didn't get any sort of GL buff, right? Special GLs were deemed by Bungie to not really need adjusting, so they didn't get a spec mod compensation. So you can see here, that's why they're suffering so much. Now, Dragon's Breath is an exception, right? Dragon's Breath, I will say, is as a result of testing difference. So some people were saying that some of the numbers in my spreadsheet were kind of too idealized, too optimal. And so, for example, Deathbringer, when I put the numbers in my spreadsheet, I simulated it being the maximum amount of damage, right? Like max height on all the projectiles. Realistically speaking, that's never going to happen, right? So the reason why I adjusted Dragon's Breath is because I tested Dragon's Breath a bunch of times, and I basically took the highest number last season, and the highest number is like 4 ignitions, like super great RNG, which is like not going to happen on most of, like the vast majority of your Dragon's Breath shots, right? Assuming the boss is even like compatible with Dragon's Breath. So this is a much more realistic number, which is why it took such a hit. Obviously, Dragon's Breath didn't get buffed either, but that's why it reduced its damage per shot so much. This is a testing methodology thing and not a Bungie nerf Dragon's Breath by 30% type of thing, not a thing like that, okay? So the next column I want to show you guys is the adjusted column. Now, the adjusted column, this is a little bit interesting. And so the raw column just gives you a real sense of if I shot a weapon in Lightfall versus shooting a weapon now, how much damage did I lose per shot from shooting those weapons, right? So you'll see most of the weapons here, minus 15%, minus 10%, minus 20. It's around that area, right? That's kind of expected. Now, the adjusted column, this is a little bit different. So the adjusted column, the purpose of this column is to show you guys what weapons were over buffed and what weapons were over nerfed compared to what Bungie deems to be the baseline. So the baseline I decided for this column would be rapid fire fusions. Now, why did I pick rapid fire fusions? Fusion rifles showed a very stable and like no error bar, no like inflated damage when I tested them before the season as well as this season. So I thought they were a good option, number one. Number two, fusion rifles, they received a spec mod compensation. There's a lot of fusion rifles out there, And it's because they received the spec mod compensation, they got minus 7.777%, and then they got a plus 7% in exchange. And that lands them right around where I think Bungie wants the baseline of weapon balance to be, right? So if a weapon's balanced, basically Bungie didn't touch it much. So that's why I chose the rapid fire fusion rifle to be our 0 mark, right? So you'll see it's 0% here. Now, all of the other changes that are above this got buffed more than the baseline, and all of the changes that are below this got nerfed more than the baseline. So this is kind of an interesting column because you can see swords with Pack Hunter got buffs. Acreus got a buff for some reason. Oh, actually, no, this isn't a buff. Last season I tested Acreus with body shot damage. This season was with precision damage. So this is a bit misleading. That's why that is the way it is. But you can see swords are dominating the top here. They're all kind of at the top here. I think precision shotguns, pellet shotguns, I tested with precision damage this season, which is why it got an increase. So you can kind of ignore that. Cloud Strike, right? You can see got a little bit of a buff because the sniper damage itself got a buff. And obviously Cloud Strike didn't lose spec mods. So while the Storm didn't get buffed, the actual shots, per shots on Cloud Strike did get buffed. So you can see that's kind of represented here. A couple other things. Heart Shadow got better testing methodology this season. That's why it got a buff. Thunderlord, I believe, received the global machine gun buff. So that's why it's a little bit higher. And then there's a lot of stuff that's lower, right? And you can see exactly what I mean when I say, Mountaintop received the kinetic special nerf. Izanagi's minus 15. That's almost exactly the kinetic special nerf. Forerunner, again, kinetic special nerf. You can see here that kind of like related to the universal baseline of the rapid fire fusion. A lot of stuff did get kind of nerfed in exchange. You can see rockets, for example, all got that 8% nerf, which is like the result of not getting a spec mod compensation. Same thing with heavy GLs, around 7-8%. So it's kind of cool, right? I know obviously Bungie shows us the numbers, or at least some of the numbers, and says, this is going to be nerfed by this much, this is going to be buffed by this much. But this is a really nice visual way of seeing how everything in the sandbox across a large gradient has changed for the better or changed for the worse. So that's why I thought this was like an interesting tab. Feel free to, play around with this if you want to see more. But that's pretty much all I have to say about base damage values. Let's move on to the bosses tab. So the bosses tab, some interesting stuff here, some clarifications I want to make, right? Obviously, I'm not perfect, right? I do a lot of damage testing. I would say I probably do some of the most extensive damage testing in this game, but I'm bound to make mistakes. And so one of the things that I want to clarify with boss damage is some of the modifiers. But before we talk about that, let's just talk about the 1950 change, right? So like I said before, boss damage was normalized across all different bosses in this game because every single raid and dungeon now has a 1950 recommended power level. And so this is a really nice thing for damage testers because now Xenophage does 34,251 damage to every single boss in the game outside of encounter modifiers, which is really cool, right? This is really great. It means that whenever I test damage against Templar, if I don't like Templar's boss model, for example, for sorting, Templar is really annoying, I can go to Riven and I can test on Riven and the numbers will be the same as if they were on Templar. So really, really nice stuff. Really, really happy about this change. But that aside, there are some corrections that I'd like to make. So in the past, I've said that Morgeth has a modified crit. I've said that he has a 0.6 times crit multiplier. I said the same of Riven. Now the reason for that is because I was testing Sleeper Simulant on Morgeth and Riven. And for whatever reason at the time, when Last Wish / Forsaken were released, Sleeper was an extremely meta weapon. So for whatever reason, Bungie decided to bake in a 40% damage resistance against Sleeper on Morgeth and Riven for whatever reason. And so because of that, it looked like crit values were doing 40% less. I was getting 60% damage numbers on Morgeth and Riven. So that is why I've revised my testing methodology to use Queenbreaker. And so Queenbreaker does not have any intrinsic damage resistance from Morgeth and Riven. And so I found out that the crit value is actually the same. It's just 1. It's just 1.0, right? You can use crit weapons against Morgeth and Riven. However, Morgeth and Riven also have damage resistance against snipers and shotguns. So most of the crit weapons that are relevant, I suppose, against Morgeth and Riven do have some sort of damage resistance. So it'll kind of appear like a lot of crit weapons are not very good. You can use legendary linears and linears that are not sleeper against Morgeth and Riven and experience like normal results. But for the most part, I don't think those weapons are really the meta on these bosses anyways, but that's just something I wanted to point out, which is kind of a correction. Another thing, I used to tell people that Oryx took 90% of a regular shot if you shot him with body shot weapons compared to if you shot him with something like a sniper in the crit. This is not true. Now, the reason why I thought this was because Xenophage has some special properties where obviously most of its damage is explosive and it's kind of distributed between impact and explosive damage. Now, Oryx, and I've noticed this on the Witness as well, his chest crit has some interesting geometry on its hitbox, and so when you shoot him in the chest with Xeno, over and over and over, you'll see that every single damage number that you get against the Witness or Oryx changes because you're shooting a slightly different part of his body, and so the geometry is slightly different and you don't do full damage. And so when I was testing against Oryx, I noticed that Xenophage was doing less damage, and so I just assumed that was because Oryx is a crit boss, and so body shots do less damage. However, that's usually not how crits work in this game. If a boss has a modified crit, it'll do normal body damage, and then the weapon that's special, so like a crit or like a sword on Crota, would do more damage. It's not like crits will do normal damage and body damage will do less. So that was the first red flag. And the second red flag is obviously there were a couple shots when I did Oryx footage this season where I did normal damage. I actually did do normal damage. I did 1.0 damage. So Oryx does not take more crit damage. I want to specify that. Or Oryx does not take reduced body damage, which was what my claim was earlier. He is a normal crit boss. Xenophage just happens to do variable damage to him depending on where exactly you shoot in his crit. Even if you shoot him straight in the middle of the crit, it will sometimes just do reduced damage. So that's just something that you should be aware of. The Witness is the same way, by the way. So I did some extensive testing. I mean, the Witness also has a chest crit, which is, I guess, kind of a coincidence, but is also the same way. Xenophage will do slightly different damage every time you shoot him in the chest. Speaking of which, right? A lot of people have been asking me, Aegis, is the Herald like a sword specialized boss like Crota? Does he take more damage from swords? No, I've confirmed that he does not. Does the Witness take more damage from crit weapons? No, he does not. Herald and the Witness are both normal bosses, bone stock standard bosses. Nothing special about them when it comes to weapon damage modifiers. Okay, a couple other things. Let's see here. Caretaker, yes. So Caretaker, in prior seasons, if you shot Caretaker with like Xenophage, compared to if you shot him or shot like a normal boss with the same scalar, you would do 2.33 times your normal damage on the wipe screen and visually. This season that has changed, it's now 2 times. I'm assuming this is as a result of being changed to like 1950 power level. So just know that any damage number that you shoot to Caretaker and you go shoot another boss, it's going to be 2 times higher. Okay. That's pretty much it for Caretaker. That's also why his health is like so absurdly high at 35 million. He doesn't actually have 35 million health, right? If you want a boss that truly has the most health in the game, that would be the Witness. You can just divide this number by 2, and that's that. Okay, a couple notes. So Atraks, where's Atraks? Atraks is somewhere here. There we go. Atraks. So Atraks is interesting because Atraks doesn't have a crit modifier visually. So if you're to shoot Atraks with Xenophage, and then you shoot Atraks with Sleeper right in the chest where her crit is, the numbers that you see there will come out as expected numbers, right? So the crit scalar, the crit ratio looks normal. However, from the testing that I've done with Atraks, if you were to do just crit damage to Atraks, so you only did Goldies, you only did Sleeper, you only did Izzy's, whatever it is, Atraks takes less health bar damage, so she has effectively a bigger health bar when you shoot her with crit weapons. And this difference was somewhere around 25 to 30%. So I said, again, 27.8% there in the notes. So don't use crit weapons on Atraks. They do less damage to her health bar. I will show you visually the proof of this once we move to the boss health spreadsheet, but just know that that's something that I found. Last season, I did say that crit weapons appear to be less effective on Atraks, but I didn't do enough extensive testing to really know any exact numbers. This season, I have a more precise number. They're around 25 to 30% less effective on Atraks, despite what the wipe screen may tell you. Kell Echo. So I got messages from a guy like last season. I forgot what his name is, so shout out to you. But someone messaged me last season saying that when they were doing like a solo Kell Echo and they finished the activity and they showed me their damage summary, that their total damage number, they were using like Shrine Titan or something, was like completely different from what I had in the spreadsheet. And so I did some like digging and I found out that Kell Echo, for whatever reason, this is like the only boss in the game that does this, but Kell Echo, when you shoot Kell Echo, like let's say you shoot her with Xenophage, right? And you do 30,000 to her, right? Or him, I don't know, him, her. But let's say you do 30,000 damage with a weapon. You jump off the map, the wipe screen will show 60,000. I don't know why this is the case. There is no other boss that's anything like this, but Kell Echo takes 2 times damage on the wipe screen. I have no idea why. It's not like Riven, where like the mouth takes 2 times damage, but also on the wipe screen, like her effective health is still the same. Because like at least on Riven, when you shoot her in the mouth, you still see the number being 2 times higher. On Kell Echo, for whatever reason, if you shoot Kell Echo and then jump off the map, like the number on the wipe screen will just be 2 times higher, and the number in the damage summary at the end of the activity will also be 2 times higher. I have no idea why this is the case. I talked to Crew, who was obviously done a lot of prof, and he said like this has been known for a long time. I just don't know why this is the case. It's the only boss that does this. I don't know. Okay, that's Kell Echo. Caiatl. Okay, so I promised last season that I would do some testing with Caiatl's crit, And so I did it this season, right? And so Caiatl's crit's a little weird. I tested like the 3 major categories of crit weapons that people use on bosses, that being slugs, snipers, and linears. I probably should have tested Goldie now that I think about it, but too late for that. Anyways, slugs, snipers, and linears. So Caiatl has 2 crits, right? Like a typical Cabal, she has her head and then she has her backpack, right? She has her backpack kind of red V armor core thingy, right? If you shoot her backpack, it does completely normal crit damage, right? So same normal 1.0 crit multiplier. If you shoot her in the head, it depends on what weapon you use. So for snipers and linears, her crit was a 1.35 times multiplier, and for slug shotguns, it was 1.21 times. Okay. Now, I've been told by someone, I don't remember, this was like months and months ago, but someone told me that her crit changes based on the precision ratio of the weapon you're shooting her with. Right, so that kind of makes sense. I guess snipers and linears have like a very high crit to body ratio, whereas slugs, not so much. Snipers and linears are much less forgiving, so it makes sense that they would have a higher crit multiplier. I might test Goldie at some point. I would assume it's going to be somewhere around here. Probably does more damage, but yeah, that's Caiatl, right? She's a modified crit, so that's kind of interesting. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about the bosses tab. So let's move on and go to the boss health spreadsheet. So if you want to look at the boss health spreadsheet, just click on this health kind of heading here, click on boss health, and we'll go over there. So this is a very interesting spreadsheet. Now, this is where all the magic happens, right? If you want to know how does Aegis actually calculate the boss health of all these bosses in the game, this is how I do it. Okay, so I have this in a methodology video in like the part 7 of my damage testing series or whatever, but I'm going to go over it again here. So basically what I do is I have Corolla's Destiny Damage Tracker, which is an application. It's the auto-loading holster icon in my taskbar. And what it does is it reads orange pixels in the bottom part of my screen and it looks for that boss health bar. And I think about like 20 times a second, it calculates how many orange pixels are left on my screen versus the black pixels where the health bar used to be. Right? So this is basically a pixel perfect way of measuring the health bar of a boss. And so how do I calculate the health of a boss? Well, I take Xenophage. I record myself shooting the boss with Xenophage over and over and over and over. And I check, make sure, it's the same damage every time. Xenophage can sometimes be a little inconsistent. On stuff like Witness, I had to literally like write down the individual numbers I was seeing on screen every single shot. But for, thankfully for most bosses, that's not the case, right? So what I do is I shoot the boss with like 34 Xeno, 28 Xeno, whatever it is, and I try to get as much damage out as possible. And I write down what DDT says is the health bar pixel value for every single shot, right? So for example, here it goes from 99.763 whatever all the way down to 92.017 whatever, right? And then I write down the damage that Xeno did for every single one of those shots. I add it up, and then we make it into this line graph, right? So this line graph, Cali health approximation. On the x-axis, we have the percentage dealt based on Corolla's Destiny Damage Tracker tool again in the bottom. And then we have on the y-axis the actual damage that the game thinks we're dealing to the boss, right? And this is a safe metric to use. I say that, wipe screen damage is inaccurate or like on-screen damage is inaccurate, but I know for a fact that Xenophage does not have any health bar inflation, so Xenophage is a safe option to use here. So if we compare the x-axis to the y-axis, we get a nice series of relatively straight dots. And the reason why obviously some of these dots are higher or lower is because, pixel measurement is not perfect, right? Every single pixel might represent thousands of health. So there's some margin of error, but that's why we have 28 shots of testing. So if we test 28 shots, we can get a line of best fit, which, kind of reduces this error from pixels being thousands of health apart. And eventually we get this line of best fit and we get a line of best fit equation, right? We get a linear approximation. And so this linear approximation, if we just multiply by 100, we can find the actual total damage or total health value of the boss. And so in this case, based on this line of best fit, if we were to continue all the way to 100%, we know that Cali has about 14.7 or so million health. So yeah, that's how I calculate boss health. And so the thing I wanted to talk about Atraks is if we go over to Atraks, you'll see that if we do body damage to Atraks, this is a relatively straight line, despite the fact that Atraks is quite a weird boss and, she has all these health thresholds and different clones and whatever, and that, there's those glowing yellow numbers after she breaks. This is a relatively straight line, right? So pretty accurate stuff. And if we are to do just body damage, so just Xenophage damage, this model predicts that Atraks has around 4 million health, right? Now, if we are to use Sleeper, this is also a relatively straight line. I think you and I would agree. This is a relatively straight line. There's nothing kind of fishy going on here. And yet, this line of best fit slope is completely different and predicts a 5.06 million health damage value for Atraks. And so we can say here confidently that the difference between crit and body weapons is quite significant on Atraks, despite the fact that the wipe screen does not reflect that. And we can say that, the health bar this is the one time where a health bar measuring tool is actually much more accurate than something like maybe Darcy measuring or or knucklehead measuring, right? So quite an interesting thing for sure. But yeah, that's how I found Atraks, the crit modifier change, the crit ratio change. Okay, so that's basically it for Atraks. Now, finally, to end this video, I want to talk about two more things. Corolla's Destiny damage tracker, right? It has two different modes for those of you that have not used it, right? It has a testing, it has a final stand mode and has a no final stand mode, okay? Because obviously, if you have a health bar with a final stand bar, right? If you have a tool that, you know, counts up all the pixels that are health bar, it has to choose whether to ignore that final stand divider pixel or to include it, right? And so a question I asked Corolla was, hey Corolla, you know, is the final stand divider actually part of the health bar, right? Does the game just skip over that white line that separates final from main damage? Or is that actually some health there that's represented that needs to be killed, that needs to be pushed through, right? And so he didn't know. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to go test this on the one boss that we know has a ton of dividers, and that's Shirochi. Shirochi has 5, not 1, but 5 different dividers. They're kind of like mini final stands, right? She basically has 5 final stands in a way, right? And so what I did, right, was, you know, pretty cool, I suppose, is I went to Shirochi and we did 5 breaks worth of health. We did 5 breaks worth of health to Shirochi. So I have a hidden tab here called Shirochi No Finals, right? And we did 5 breaks worth of health. And so if I go ahead and go to my testing folder here, we go to health, we go to TFS. Let's go ahead and look for Shirochi, right? Shiro bar testing. So Shiro bar testing, I basically recorded me and my friends using non-inflation weapons. So stuff like Nighthawk, no inflation, stuff like Still Hunt, no inflation, stuff like Slug shotguns, no inflation, right? So we made sure not to use Izzy here. And so we did 5 breaks of health. So we go all the way down here. 5 breaks of health, and if you see here, the health bar ends up at 18.934911%, right? So with a bit of proportional math, let's go ahead and do 100 minus 18.934911. We did 81% of Shirochi's health, and the wipe screen value, which should be accurate because there's no inflation or over damaging, should be 10.473 million damage, right? So if we go ahead and do 100 divided by 81.065089, and then we multiply it by 10473220, we get a total damage value of 12.9 million damage. And so this is an important number. Remember 12.9 million total damage, okay? Let's go to Shirochi health approximation. This was when I used Destiny damage tracker, ignoring the final stand dividers, ignoring all of those dividers. Xenophage approximated a 13.1 million total health value, which is a solid 250k off what we should have expected if Shirochi's health bar dividers actually count as part of her health bar. And so I knew they don't count as part of her health bar. And so we can assume going forward that any sort of boss with a final stand or multiple dividers in its health bar, those divider pixels don't count towards the health bar, and you should just count the pixels that are not part of those dividers. And so if we go to our new Shirochi value, right, 12.795 or 12.8, this is a lot closer to reality, a lot closer to that proportional math that I showed you earlier. Obviously that too, we didn't do 6 breaks because, you know, Shirochi doesn't have an end game, you know, summary screen that you can see all the damage because she's not a final boss. But this is a lot closer, makes a lot more sense. And so I'm glad I was able to answer that question. Kind of an interesting question for sure. Not something that I think an ordinary player would really ever think about asking because it's kind of just a weird question. But now you know, right? Final stand, health bars, those pixels don't actually count as part of the health bar if you're just counting pixels. Okay, so that's the second last thing I want to talk about. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about. And that's going to be this interesting tab here that I made yesterday. So one of my friends in chat, whose name is Zito, he's a speedrunner, he asked me the question, did the effective health of any boss change going into the final shape? And so I was kind of like, well, I mean, probably not, right? I mean, that seems silly that Bungie would do that. Like, I don't think Bungie would do that, right? Because basically what Bungie did is, yes, all the numerical health values of basically every raid and dungeon boss in the game did change. And that's because all of them were normalized to 1950, you know, recommended power level. And so I thought that's probably the only change, right? So probably every boss in the game probably changed their, you know, effective health value by minus 15% or whatever it is, because we are now, you know, 25% surges, but we're also minus 5 power, right? Boy, was I wrong. Boy, was I wrong. So this is where my kind of investigation kind of stops, because I don't really know how to explain my results here. I only know that I did get these results. So if you guys have any theories, or if people like Mossy in the community have any ideas as to why this is the case, I would be interested to know why. But I have an absolutely massive band of results here that spans from a -1% change to a 34% change. So what do I mean by -1 to 34, first of all? So what do all these numbers mean? So let's talk about it. So first column here, pre-final shape Xenophage did a bunch of different numbers to a bunch of different bosses. Like we talked about this before, but almost every raid encounter, every dungeon encounter in the game had a different recommended power level. So for example, right, if we can go ahead and find Callie, on Callie we do a measly 11.5k with Xeno. But if we find a more modern boss like Ekthar, we're doing 35k to that boss. And so what I found was like the best way to kind of measure effective health for a more comprehensible understanding is I would take the actual health of that boss and divide it, or the encounter health of that boss, I would divide it by the Xeno value. So if we see here, Kell Echo takes 171 Xeno shots, no buff, no debuff, no surges, 171 Xeno shots. Callie takes 383 Xeno shots to kill, right? So this is like pretty, you know, makes sense, right? Pretty easy to understand. Post the final shape, every single boss in the game now takes the exact same amount from Xeno, outside of some small things like Crypt Security, you know, Dolan Kara with Finite Thought ×3, Caretaker, etc., right? So every boss takes the same amount from Xeno. The health values did change, right? And so what I did is I measured every single boss's effective health using how much Xeno does before and after the final shape. Now, Xenophage also did get a 7% global buff from machine guns and did not get a spec mod removal given that it's an exotic weapon. So I had to also apply this 7% buff, and I reverted it basically. And so I calculated the effective health change between pre-final shape and current final shape. And this is what I got. So if you go ahead and take a look at dungeons, the vast majority of the dungeon bosses in the game with 25% surges did not become harder to kill. So stuff like Ekthar, stuff like Rathel, stuff like Avarok, you know, all these modern dungeon bosses, their effective health has not really changed that much. Okay, so you know, take it or leave it. That's kind of how that is, right? And if we talk about the kind of middle ground here, this is where I expected most of the bosses to end up being, somewhere around the 15% range. I don't know why this has happened, but a lot of the raid bosses have skyrocketed in effective health, even accounting for surges, even accounting for RPL changes. I don't know why this has happened. Bosses like Crota have gone up in like 34% in terms of effective health. That makes no sense. I don't know why that's the case. It could be a sort of measurement error, and maybe I was measuring the health of these bosses incorrectly last season, but I really have strong doubts about that. That makes no sense. Because it's not just one boss, right? It's not just Crota. You have Explicator gaining 34% effective health. You have a bunch of bosses here that are gaining like a crap load of effective health. Something else I noticed, I expected every boss in the game to get an increase in like in-game wipe screen health, but apparently not. Like some bosses like Heffen, for example, lost health, which doesn't really make any sense. Because I thought the RPL went up even for this encounter. So yeah, I'm not really sure what's going on here. If you guys want to do some investigation of your own, kind of verify my numbers, I would appreciate that. But I genuinely have no idea why this is such a huge variance. Why there is such huge variance in my numbers here. It doesn't make any sense why some bosses have received like 30+% increases in effective health, while a lot of bosses, well, I mean, dungeon bosses kind of make sense, but a lot of the raid bosses are kind of sitting at like 11, right? Doesn't really make any sense. So, yeah, that's basically all I have to say for this video. I have a lot of videos coming out pretty soon. I'm going to talk about like changes in weapon DPS meta, changes in ability, you know, DPS meta, what you should use for every single raid and dungeon boss these days after the final shape has come out. This video has been a bit of a yap fest, a lot of very, very data dense video. But I'm going to try and overlay some footage of me testing the health bars of every single boss in the game to hopefully, you know, tide you over. That's basically it. I'll see you guys later. I can't promise any videos in like the near future because I'm about to do a lot more testing in the near future, especially with Ergo Sum. But yeah, that's basically it. So I'll see you guys later. Bye bye.